A slave ship is headed toward West Africa. It has white crew members on board, in addition to the captain and a slave trader who owns the ship. Once docked at the harbor, all of them would go on a slave hunt, trying to raid small villages and capture as many slaves as possible. The plan is carried out, and now they have captured hundreds of black slaves. They are chained and marched toward the slave ship. However, the captured black Africans don't know what's happening. Why have they been captured and taken to ships? Many had heard stories that white people from distant lands come and capture black Africans and do nasty things. They had no idea that they had been enslaved and were being taken to the New World, where they would live their entire lives as slaves. However, the most difficult times for these enslaved black Africans were on the slave ships. They were free just a few hours ago, but were now in chains. Yet they did not know what would be done with them on the ship, aimed at putting them under control and establishing the authority of the white crew. So, what was done with the black slaves on slave ships? In this video, let's know about this painful chapter of black history.
The Black History Archives.
The Atlantic slave trade began in 1526, when the Portuguese first brought African slaves to colonial Brazil. This practice quickly spread as merchants from Spain, Britain, France, Denmark, and the Netherlands recognized the immense profits to be made. They eagerly joined the trade, brushing aside any moral or ethical concerns in favor of the wealth it brought to their nations and the fortunes amassed by the traders involved. From the 16th to the 19th century, this tragic period saw about 12 million Africans who were living peaceful lives, violently uprooted from their homelands, stripped of their identities, and treated as mere commodities for economic exploitation. Many of those captured in this brutal system became part of the transatlantic slave trade, a vast network connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The journey from Africa to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage, was nothing short of a nightmare. During the 16th and 17th centuries, this harrowing voyage could take up to 6 months. However, advancements in navigation in the 18th and 19th centuries shortened the trip to just weeks. This increase in efficiency only escalated the volume of human cargo, men, women, and children who were seen not as people, but as goods to be sold to plantation owners in the New World. The horror began even before the ships set sail. Captured and kidnapped from various regions across Africa, these individuals were gathered in coastal port cities, often after enduring long, brutal marches shackled together in what was known as slave trains. These captives, from diverse backgrounds and speaking different languages, had never seen the ocean or boarded a ship. The terror they felt upon encountering these massive vessels, which would soon become their prisons, was unimaginable. Once they reached the port cities, the captives were marched onto the ships and confined below decks. Olaudah Equiano, a former slave who later became a key figure in the abolition movement, vividly described his traumatic experiences on a slave ship. He recounted his initial confusion and terror, unsure whether the white men intended to kill or consume him. On board, he saw countless other Africans, all chained together, their faces etched with sorrow and despair. The fear was so overwhelming that he fainted at the sight. The conditions on these ships were beyond horrific. The chains that bound the enslaved Africans cut into their skin, making any movement excruciatingly painful. Death was a constant companion on these voyages, with many captives succumbing to disease, starvation, or sheer despair. The dead were often left among the living for hours or even days before being thrown overboard. The stench of death and disease permeated the lower decks, further weakening the health and spirits of those who survived. Men and women were typically segregated into different compartments, creating an environment rife with abuse, particularly against women. Sexual violence was tragically common, as female slaves were subjected to rape, and other forms of abuse by the sailors and crew. This abuse was rarely discouraged unless it disrupted the voyage. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community, and we need your support. Let's continue now. In most cases, the captured slaves belonged to the same village and knew each other. To make their experience worse, crew members would discover which woman was the wife of which man. After this, they would separate them, leaving the man worried about his wife. Then, the woman was taken to the men's compartment and sexually abused before all the men. This was a way for the crew to establish authority and to show they could do whatever they wanted. Worst acts were committed before children to ensure they absorbed the fear forever. John Newton recounted a particularly disturbing incident in which one of his crewmen brutally assaulted a pregnant woman on board, doing so in plain view of the entire quarterdeck. Any sign of resistance or disobedience was met with brutal punishment. One of the most common forms of torture was the use of thumb screws, devices designed to slowly crush the victim's thumbs and inflict maximum pain. This cruel treatment showed the complete dehumanization the enslaved Africans endured on these floating dungeons. Even though enslaved individuals were seen as profitable assets by the crew, they were subjected to severe starvation, receiving only meager portions of food. The dreadful conditions on board, coupled with relentless abuse and the constant dread of an unknown fate in a foreign land, drove many to the brink of despair. Overwhelmed by their circumstances, some sought any opportunity to end their lives. After enduring such horrors, it was difficult for them to imagine that life in a new land could be any better. In their relentless pursuit of profit, slave traders packed ships far beyond their intended capacity. Designed to carry hundreds, these vessels were often overloaded with thousands of captives, crammed so tightly that they had scarcely any space to move, sit, or sleep. The conditions were so cramped that basic necessities, like buckets for waste, were often inaccessible, forcing the enslaved to endure their own filth. The notorious Brookes slave ship, for example, illustrated these inhumane conditions, and its detailed diagrams later became powerful evidence against the slave trade. Olaudah Equiano, a former slave who became a prominent abolitionist, shared a harrowing account of his experiences aboard a slave ship. He described being hit by an overpowering stench below deck, a smell so unbearable that it made eating impossible and led him to long for death as his only escape. Defying the crew often brought severe consequences. Those who refused to eat, attempted escape, or showed any signs of resistance were typically subjected to brutal floggings. Equiano himself was severely flogged for refusing to eat and held down by two men while a third lashed him mercilessly. Rebellions, though rare, were met with extreme violence. Desperate captives, feeling they had nothing to lose, sometimes rose up against the crew, only to be brutally suppressed by cannon fire, muskets, and further bloodshed. Captives were allowed on deck only when the weather permitted. Otherwise, they were forced to endure the suffocating heat and stench below deck, packed in with hundreds of others. For many, it felt as if they were buried alive. The unsanitary and oppressive conditions on these ships created breeding grounds for disease. Overcrowding, combined with the stifling heat, led to profuse sweating and air so foul that it was barely breathable. Dysentery, or the flux, was particularly deadly, and outbreaks were a constant fear. A former ship surgeon once compared the blood and mucus-covered rooms to a slaughterhouse. Maintaining the health and survival of the enslaved individuals during the voyage was crucial for the ship's profitability. Crew members would go to great lengths to ensure the captives ate, resorting to flogging and other punishments to enforce compliance. Consider the chilling account of an enslaved individual aboard the Loyal George, a ship that made the brutal journey across the Atlantic to Barbados in 1727. This particular man, in a desperate act of resistance, refused to eat, becoming frail and sickly. Captain Timothy Tucker, alarmed that this act of defiance might incite the other 200 captives on board, resorted to extreme measures. He commanded his cabin boy to fetch a large horsewhip and proceeded to have the man flogged mercilessly. Even under the threat of death, the man simply replied, "Adoma," which in his language meant, "So be it," a haunting acceptance of his fate. The practice of throwing enslaved individuals overboard was a horrifyingly common occurrence during the Atlantic slave trade. This brutal act allowed ship owners to file insurance claims for each drowned person. Typically, captives were cast into the sea when they became severely ill or were near death, as insurance policies did not cover sickness. Drowning, therefore, became a tragic last resort for slave traders looking to protect their profits. However, in some cases, slaves were also thrown off of the ships when the weight of the ship was too much. In their greed, slave traders would cram the ship, but this brought threats of sinking. Yet, if they threw the slaves, those who had invested in the voyages would doubt that slaves were not captured in the first place. Therefore, a horrific act was done. Before throwing slaves in the ocean, their ears were dismembered. These ears would be shown to the investors that slaves were captured but had to be thrown for safety. After enduring 6 to 8 agonizing weeks aboard the slave ship, the surviving captives finally reached a port in the Americas. Olaudah Equiano, who survived this horrific ordeal, described the initial terror that gripped the enslaved people, many of whom feared they were to be eaten. Their fears were somewhat alleviated when older slaves, brought by the slavers to reassure the new arrivals, explained that they were destined for labor, not consumption. This small relief did nothing to change the grim reality that lay ahead, a life of enslavement, where their humanity would be routinely disregarded. Did you know such events took place on the slave ships? Do you think that they would teach this part of history in schools? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts if you would like your children to know this dark reality or live unaware of the real history. Would you like us to make more videos? If yes, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.